Lori Blake had never imagined she would find herself living in the kind of place where neighbors watched one another's driveways with a hawk's patience, noting the slightest deviation from routine as though it were a betrayal of some unspoken order. For most of her adult life, she had lived in cities, moving from one anonymous apartment to another, her work as a forensic sketch artist for law enforcement shielding her with a sense of purpose while at the same time exhausting her until the thought of community felt almost burdensome. When her aunt passed and left her the house on the edge of a gentrified rural development, Lori had accepted the inheritance with mixed feelings. On the one hand, it was a retreat, a chance to replace the constant noise of sirens and arguments through paper-thin walls with the softer rhythm of wind moving through fields and the occasional call of a night bird. On the other hand, it was a place pressed up against an environment of manicured lawns and watchful residents who demanded conformity. The property itself was unlike the newer homes that surrounded it. Where the others were designed with symmetrical facades, trimmed hedges, and the bland uniformity of development planning, Lori's home carried the imprint of decades of use and adaptation. The clapboard siding was weathered. The porch sagged slightly in one corner, and a sprawling willow tree cast an uneven curtain of shade across the yard. But the most important feature, the one that bound her to the house with a sense of responsibility, was the old stone well tucked behind a cluster of lilac bushes. Her aunt had told her, long before she grew sick, that the well was fed by an underground vein of water that had supplied generations of families before the neighborhood even existed, and Lori believed it, not just as fact but as a kind of inheritance of memory and survival. When she turned the iron crank and heard the bucket echo against the stone shaft, she felt more grounded than she had in years. It was no wonder that she guarded it so fiercely, cleaning the surrounding area, checking the rope, even marking the water levels in a notebook as if she were monitoring the heartbeat of the land itself. The first weeks after moving in were quiet enough that she could almost pretend the house stood alone, but gradually the presence of her nearest neighbor began to intrude. Karen Winslow occupied the mansion across the road, a sprawling structure with marble pillars, a sculpted driveway, and a tendency to gleam unnaturally at night under the relentless sweep of floodlights. Karen, a widow of a local judge and a woman who had chaired nearly every committee the Homeowners Association had ever produced, was a figure both admired and feared within the community. Her lawn was immaculate, her hedges pruned with the precision of surgical instruments, and her social gatherings were invitations one did not decline if one wished to maintain standing among the rest. Lori, uninterested in any of it, politely ignored Karen's overtures of control. The neighborly suggestions delivered with a smile too stiff to be genuine. The brochures about association membership slid into her mailbox. The not-so-subtle remarks about property values and expectations. At first, Karen kept her distance, treating Lori as an amusing anomaly. But when Lori declined to join the latest round of neighborhood inspections organized under the guise of ecological responsibility, the atmosphere shifted. One late afternoon, Lori returned from town to find Karen and two other residents standing near her well, clipboards in hand, discussing measurements in the self-important tones of regulators. When Lori asked what they were doing, Karen explained, as if she were being charitable, that the neighborhood had adopted new guidelines to modernize water systems and that uncovered wells were considered both unsafe and environmentally questionable. Lori listened, felt her pulse quicken with disbelief, and finally responded in the calmest voice she could manage that the well was her family's property, registered as part of the deed, and that no guideline invented at a suburban committee meeting could erase that. Karen's smile froze for an instant, and in that brief crack Lori saw something colder than simple annoyance. She saw the beginnings of intent. That evening, sitting on the porch with the cicadas droning around her and the air cooling into a soft dusk, Lori replayed the encounter in her mind. She knew how people like Karen operated. They clothed aggression in civility, wielded bureaucracy like a blade, and ensured that any resistance could be painted as obstinacy or paranoia. Years of working with victims had taught Lori to read faces, and the look in Karen's eyes had been clear, a calculation, an assessment of how far she could push. Lori tried to shake it off, telling herself she would simply remain firm and distant. But when she checked the well one last time before bed, she found herself running her fingers along the stone rim as though assuring the structure that she would protect it. In that moment, the house and the well felt like the only allies she had, and though she could not articulate it, she sensed that the quiet she had sought was already beginning to fracture under the weight of someone else's control. It was in the second month of Lori's stay, on a morning when the sky hung low with a haze of late summer heat, that she first noticed something was wrong with the well. She had gone out as she did every morning, carrying a mug of coffee and her notebook, intent on measuring the water line before the sun climbed too high. The yard still held the dampness of night, and the willow's branches dripped a steady rhythm onto the grass. At first glance, the well looked unchanged, the same circle of stone with its worn crank and the faint moss creeping along the edges. But when she lowered the bucket and heard it scrape instead of splash, her stomach tightened. She peered down into the darkness, expecting to see a glimmer of water reflecting back, but instead there was only a flat, dull surface several feet lower than usual, a surface that looked opaque and strangely pale. Lowering herself until her knees pressed against the stone, she leaned farther and realized with growing horror that the bottom was not water at all, but a hardening mass of gray cement, smooth in some places, rippled in others, as though poured hastily by hands eager to finish under cover of night. For a long moment she simply stared, unable to process the enormity of what she was seeing, then jerked the bucket back up and felt the rope come away coated in thin streaks of wet residue that smelled of lime and grit. Someone had poisoned the heart of her home. Someone had turned her inheritance into a tomb. The thought came unbidden, sharp and undeniable. Karen. Who else had motive? Who else had spoken with such disdain about the well only days before? Who else had access and the arrogance to act without fear of consequence? Lori's first impulse was to call the police, and she did, pacing her kitchen with the phone pressed tight to her ear as she explained in careful detail that her private property had been vandalized, that someone had trespassed in the night and destroyed a water source. The officer on the other end listened with the weary patience of someone already building the phrases of dismissal. He asked whether she had seen the culprit, whether there were witnesses, whether she had security cameras. When she admitted she had none, his voice softened into the kind of tone reserved for nuisances. "It sounds like a civil matter, ma'am. Perhaps a dispute with your neighborhood association. That's not really in our jurisdiction. You could consider filing a report with them." Lori slammed the phone down, rage flooding her veins. The association was Karen, and Karen was the one who had done this. To send her there was to send a lamb to the butcher. Hours later, as if mocking her despair, she found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the handle of her mailbox. The paper was unmarked, written in tidy block letters, unsigned but unmistakable in its tone. If you don't want to be part of the community, then you don't need its resources either. Adapt or move. Lori read the message twice, then crumpled it in her fist until her nails cut into her skin. Her eyes lifted toward the gleaming facade across the street, and she thought she saw the faint twitch of a curtain as though someone had been watching her reaction. For the rest of that day she moved in a haze of disbelief, trying to clean the cement from the rope, trying to scrape the stone with tools, realizing quickly how futile it was. The well was not merely obstructed, it was murdered, and every attempt to free it only confirmed how carefully the act had been executed. In the days that followed, the consequences bled into every aspect of her life. Without the well, she was forced to haul containers of water from a service station in town, struggling with the weight of the jugs up the porch steps, her muscles aching with the humiliation of it. Cooking became rationed, bathing reduced to the bare minimum, and the garden her aunt had nurtured with such devotion began to wither under the relentless sun. Neighbors passed by and saw her carrying water, and instead of sympathy their faces registered a cool detachment, as if her suffering confirmed the narrative Karen must have spread, that Lori was unstable, that her ways were outdated, that she refused to accept the progress the association promised. More than once she heard laughter drifting from across the street when she wrestled with the jugs, and though she could not prove it, she knew Karen's voice among them. What unsettled Lori most was not only the act itself, but the realization that everyone around her seemed complicit in silence. No one knocked to ask what had happened. No one offered a word of outrage. No one even mentioned the sudden absence of the well that had once drawn curiosity. The community had absorbed the event as if it were natural, as if erasing her water source was merely the price of non-compliance. Each night she sat on the porch and stared at the cemented circle, the air heavy with the scent of drying lilacs, and felt a gnawing certainty grow inside her. She was being pushed, isolated, tested to see how far she would bend. Her work offered little distraction. Drawing the faces of criminals from the half-remembered descriptions of victims only sharpened her sense of violation. Every line she sketched seemed to echo the shadow of her neighbor, and every pair of imagined eyes stared back with Karen's cold certainty. One evening, unable to contain the pressure any longer, Lori crossed the road and knocked on Karen's door. The mansion loomed against the fading light, its windows glowing with an artificial warmth that made her own house seem fragile by comparison. Karen opened the door with a smile so polished it gleamed like porcelain. "Lori," she said, her voice honeyed. "What a surprise." "Do come in." Lori stood her ground and asked plainly if Karen knew anything about what had happened to her well. For a heartbeat the smile faltered, a flicker of satisfaction breaking through, before Karen tilted her head and responded with feigned concern. "Oh, dear, I did hear there was some issue. Such a shame, really. But, you know, these old wells can be very dangerous, collapsing suddenly, contaminating the ground. Perhaps it's for the best." Modern systems are so much safer. Lori felt her nails dig into her palms but forced herself to remain silent, watching the way Karen's eyes glittered in the hall light. It was not a denial, not even close. It was a confession disguised as neighborly advice, a way of saying, "I did this and no one will stop me." When Lori turned to leave, Karen added softly, almost kindly, "You'll find life is easier if you work with the community instead of against it." The door closed with a quiet click, and Lori walked back to her darkened house with the weight of inevitability pressing against her chest. That night she could not sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the moonlight silvering the edges of the willow, and felt the cemented well pulling at her thoughts like a wound that refused to close. The catalyst had been set in motion, and whether she liked it or not, her life in this neighborhood had been transformed into a battlefield where civility masked sabotage and survival would depend on how far she was willing to go. The first escalation came not in a single dramatic act, but in the slow, grinding accumulation of pressure that turned Lori's days into a series of humiliations and suspicions, each one sharper than the last, until she began to feel her very identity bending under the weight of it. After Karen's smirking non-denial at the doorstep, Lori expected at least a pause, some respite, but instead the assaults on her stability multiplied in forms so calculated that she could not ignore their source. The Homeowners Association sent her a notice, printed on thick paper with the embossed seal of authority, stating that her property was under review for multiple violations of community standards. The letter accused her of maintaining unsafe structures, namely the well, and of neglecting to file appropriate paperwork for water management systems, as if the very existence of the ancient stone circle was now a crime. A deadline was given, a threat of fines outlined, and at the bottom, in the looping script of a signature that was more flourish than name, stood Karen's mark as head of the committee. Lori read it under the dim glow of her kitchen light, the words blurring as she realized that her neighbor's sabotage had been transformed into bureaucratic justification, turning her from victim into accused. She tried to fight in the only way she could think of, by gathering every deed, survey, and document left in her aunt's desk. For days, she pored over yellowed papers, maps with faded ink, and notarized records that confirmed the well had been part of the property long before the association existed. She carried them in a folder to the association office, a sterile building wedged between a boutique gym and a wine shop in town, and waited in the fluorescent-lit lobby until she was ushered into a room where 3 board members sat in a row like magistrates. Karen was there, of course, her pearl earrings gleaming, her smile restrained but triumphant. Laurie laid out the documents, speaking with a steadiness she did not feel, pointing to dates and signatures, explaining that the well was registered, that it was hers by right and history. The board members leafed through the pages with the distracted air of people checking their phones, then set them aside and murmured about updated bylaws and new compliance codes. Karen spoke only once, leaning forward with that same measured sweetness. It's not about history. It's about safety and community trust. The others nodded, and within 10 minutes Laurie was dismissed with a promise that her case would be under consideration. She walked out into the bright afternoon with her folder clutched tight, feeling as though she had just been tried in a court where the verdict had been written before she entered. The harassment grew bolder after that. She found her recycling bin overturned and scattered across the driveway, items she never placed in it. Wine bottles, glossy magazines, candy wrappers, arranged among her own trash as though to paint her as careless or indulgent. On another morning, she discovered a dead squirrel floating in the shallow basin of her bird bath, the water clouded with a chalky residue that smelled faintly of the same cement that had filled her well. Her mailbox began to collect anonymous pamphlets about responsible land ownership and modern community ethics, each one filled with veiled insinuations about backward individuals holding everyone else back. Laurie could see the choreography in it, the way Karen's campaign was designed not to destroy her in a single blow, but to erode her dignity one grain at a time, like sand slipping away beneath her feet until she lost balance. The practical consequences were no less punishing. With her well ruined and no municipal connection approved, she applied for temporary water delivery. But the company that serviced the area declined, citing logistical complications. When she pressed for answers, the clerk on the phone grew uneasy and finally admitted in a whisper that complaints had been filed suggesting she was operating without permits. Every avenue she sought was closed before she reached it, as though someone was shadowing her steps and locking doors in her path. At night, she lay awake and listened to the distant hum of pumps from Karen's estate, the steady rush of water feeding her ornamental ponds and fountains, a cruel reminder that abundance flowed freely on the other side of the street while her own ground lay sealed in cement. There were moments when Laurie's composure cracked. One evening, after hauling yet another set of water containers from town, she tripped on the porch steps, the jug exploding in a wave that drenched her clothes and scattered across the floorboards. She sat there for a long time, soaked and trembling, her throat tight with something between fury and despair. She thought of calling her sister in the city, of confessing how bad it had become, but pride held her back. She had chosen to stay, to build a life in this house, and she would not let Karen drive her out like some transient trespasser. Yet the isolation grew heavier. Even the grocer in town seemed to hesitate when handing her change, as though unsure whether she belonged. The breaking point came one afternoon when she decided, against reason, to confront Karen directly. She crossed the street again, walked up the immaculate stone path framed by hedges clipped to geometric perfection, and rang the bell. Karen opened the door with the same flawless poise, but before Laurie could speak, she gestured to the side of the house where a group of neighbors lounged with glasses of wine. Their laughter carried across the lawn, and when Laurie demanded to know why she had destroyed the well, Karen simply raised her eyebrows and said, "You really should be careful with accusations." Words like that can spread, and then no one will want to live near you. Communities are delicate ecosystems. The neighbors chuckled, and Lori felt the heat rise in her face. She turned without answering, humiliated by the spectacle, aware that she had been baited into performing her frustration for an audience primed to see her as unstable. That night she sat by the window, watching the lights of the mansion burn late into the evening, and realized that she was not merely in a dispute over property, but in a war of attrition designed to break her spirit. The well was gone, her reputation eroded, and the machinery of the association had been turned against her. Yet, beneath the exhaustion, something else stirred, a quiet spark of resolve. Karen believed she had silenced her by cutting off her water, by surrounding her with whispers and paperwork, but what she had done instead was awaken a resolve Lori did not know she possessed. She would not be driven out, and she would not remain passive. The escalation had begun, and Lori knew she would have to match it with her own. The breaking of her patience came not with a loud crash or a sudden act of violence, but with the slow realization that she was being pushed into invisibility, her existence reduced to a nuisance the neighborhood wished to erase, and in that moment, Lori understood that she could not remain in the role of a victim because the structure of her neighbor's power relied on her silence, on her willingness to suffer while the machinery of authority and gossip painted her as irrational. It was during one sleepless night, the kind that stretched on with the oppressive weight of cicadas outside and the glow of Karen's floodlights bleeding through the curtains, that she remembered the narrow shaft of cemented stone behind the lilacs, and wondered whether the sabotage might have extended beyond simple malice, whether perhaps it concealed something older, something hidden beneath the ground that Karen wanted buried. The thought came not as a theory, but as an instinct, the kind of intuitive leap that had guided her work as an artist when trying to reconstruct a face from scattered details, and once it appeared she could not shake it. The next morning, instead of making the usual trip to town for water, she fetched her late aunt's rusted spade from the shed and began to dig along the edge of the well, the sun rising high as the earth loosened beneath her hands. Hours passed, sweat soaking her shirt, blisters opening on her palms, until the metal struck something that reverberated differently from stone. She crouched, brushed away soil, and revealed the top of a pipe, thick and corroded, running not vertically but horizontally across her property line, as though an old channel had once carried water from beneath her land toward the opposite side of the street. She followed it with careful excavation, tracing its line toward the hedge that marked Karen's boundary, and the further she went, the clearer the structure became. It was not a random pipe, but part of a system, abandoned perhaps, but still intact. The realization struck her with a surge of bitter clarity. Karen's sabotage of the well had not been about safety or aesthetics. It had been about control, about burying evidence of her own clandestine use of the underground waterway. That night, Lori did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table surrounded by the documents she had once presented to the board, but this time she looked at them differently. Old maps, half-faded surveys, notes scrawled in the margins by surveyors long dead. All of them revealed that the well and its subterranean arteries had once supplied more than a single household. Decades ago, before the development, before the homeowners association had invented itself as an authority, the water had been shared, distributed across parcels through crude but effective channels. When the development arrived, most of the system was declared obsolete, yet the records showed gaps, inconsistencies, missing annotations where parcels had supposedly been disconnected. Lori traced one of these lines with her finger and realized it matched the direction of the pipe she had unearthed, a line that ended beneath the parcel now owned by Karen Winslow. The implications churned in her mind. If Karen's estate was still tapping into that system, if her fountains and ponds and lavish irrigation were fed by stolen water from an old artery, then the entire masquerade of environmental concern was nothing but a smokescreen. Lori imagined Karen at her committee meetings, speaking of safety and responsibility while secretly diverting what had once been a communal resource. building her grandeur on the quiet theft of what belonged to another. Rage tightened Laurie's chest, but alongside it grew a kind of grim exhilaration. For the first time since the cement had hardened in her well, she no longer felt powerless. She had discovered not just evidence of sabotage, but proof of hypocrisy, the kind that could unravel Karen's standing if exposed. Yet Laurie knew better than to imagine that presenting this to the association or the police would yield justice. They had dismissed her before, and they would again, twisting the narrative until she appeared delusional. If she wanted to reclaim her dignity, she would have to act differently, using the discovery not as evidence for authorities, but as a weapon of her own. In the days that followed, she returned to the excavation, extending the trench carefully until she found the juncture where the old pipe had been spliced into a newer line, leading directly toward Karen's estate. The connection was crude, reinforced with modern materials but clearly makeshift, the kind of work done in secrecy rather than with permits. She crouched in the dirt and ran her hand along the seam, feeling the vibration of water rushing through at high pressure, the lifeblood of Karen's empire pulsing through a stolen vein. The idea of sabotage formed slowly at first, rising like a dangerous whisper she tried to ignore, but the longer she stared at that junction, the louder it became until it was no longer a suggestion, but an inevitability. She remembered the countless jugs of water carried from town, the humiliation of being watched as she labored, the laughter drifting from the manicured lawn across the street. She remembered the cement in her well, the dead squirrel in the bird bath, the pamphlets mocking her existence. And she thought of justice, not the kind handed down by courts or committees, but the raw balance that came when harm was answered with harm. That night she drove into town, purchased bags of industrial cement and a portable mixer, her heart pounding as if she were committing a crime even before she had done anything. She stored them in the shed, hidden beneath a tarp, and for days afterward she felt the tension of waiting, the knowledge that once she acted, there would be no return. When the moment came, it was almost anticlimactic. She rose before dawn, when the neighborhood still slept and the air hung heavy with mist, and she set up the mixer near the trench. The sound was muffled by the willow's branches, the churn of gravel and powder mixing into a viscous slurry that smelled sharp and metallic. She attached a makeshift hose to the junction, her hands trembling yet precise, and when she opened the valve, the mixture surged into the pipe with a force that made her teeth clench. For minutes she fed it, watching the cement disappear into the artery that carried it straight toward Karen's pumps and reservoirs. The thought of it hardening there, filling every coil of pipe, every hidden chamber beneath that mansion, thrilled her with a savage satisfaction she had never known. By the time the sun broke the horizon, casting the first light across the rooftops, the bags were empty, the mixer silent, and Laurie stood in the trench breathing hard, her clothes streaked with gray dust and her body vibrating with the enormity of what she had done. The rest of the day she lived in a state of hyper-awareness, waiting for some explosion of consequence. From her porch, she watched Karen's estate with the intensity of a predator, noting every flicker of movement behind the windows. By afternoon, workers arrived, summoned for routine maintenance, and she saw them huddle near the fountain, their gestures animated, their voices raised. Hours later, a truck came and left, and that night the mansion's lights flickered as though something had gone terribly wrong with its systems. Laurie sat by her window and allowed herself a small smile, not of triumph, but of equilibrium. The balance had shifted, and for once Karen was the one scrambling to contain disaster. In that moment, Laurie felt a clarity she had not known in months. She was no longer a victim waiting for permission to be heard. She had crossed a threshold, one that bound her irrevocably to a course of action. But it was also the first time she felt the weight of Karen's dominance lift from her shoulders. She knew the battle was far from over. Karen would not accept humiliation quietly. But for the first time, Laurie had struck back, and the sound of cement hardening in hidden pipes was like a promise that the tide had turned. If Laurie had expected the sabotage to end the conflict, if she had naively imagined that Karen would retreat into silence after her pristine mansion began to choke on the very cement she had once poured into another's well, then the first days of quiet were a cruel illusion, because what followed was not capitulation, but a doubling of pressure, a campaign so relentless that Laurie felt herself caught in a tightening vice. At first the signs were subtle. The way the estate across the street remained cloaked in unusual silence. The way trucks came and went at odd hours with workers who carried their equipment not openly, but hidden beneath tarps, as though Karen were desperate to conceal her crisis from the rest of the neighborhood. Laurie watched through half-closed blinds and saw men in uniforms she did not recognize. Men who avoided eye contact and moved with the brisk coordination of people following orders rather than improvising. Whatever damage she had caused, Karen had mobilized resources to contain it quickly, and though Laurie could not hear their voices, she could imagine the clipped tones, the quiet fury of a woman used to control now scrambling to reassert it. The retaliation began almost immediately. A notice appeared nailed to Laurie's porch railing, not in the polite envelopes of before, but hammered crudely into the wood, as if to make the threat undeniable. It accused her of environmental negligence, of contaminating soil and water through improper storage of construction materials. There was no inspection, no evidence, merely an accusation that carried with it the promise of fines and legal action. Days later, she found bright orange tags fluttering from her fence posts, warning of impending evaluation by county officials. Strangers began to walk the perimeter of her yard, clipboards in hand, taking notes while refusing to answer her questions, their silence more unnerving than any shouted threat. It was as if Karen had extended her reach beyond the confines of the association, pulling in networks of influence that Laurie had never seen before, but now felt pressing against her from every angle. Inside her house, the pressure grew heavier still. Phone calls began to arrive at odd hours, the line filled not with voices but with silence, sometimes broken by the faint hum of machinery, sometimes by a click that signaled disconnection. Packages were delivered that she had never ordered, boxes of bottled water, stacks of pamphlets about mental health services, even a child's plastic pool left on her porch as if mocking her ruined well. Each delivery carried the same message. You are being watched, you are being ridiculed, you are being reduced to a caricature. Neighbors who once pretended indifference now crossed the street to avoid her, their faces taut with discomfort, while in the evening she saw groups gathered in Karen's driveway, their laughter rising in waves that carried across the dark road like a chorus of condemnation. And yet beneath the humiliation, Laurie felt a current of cold determination, for she understood that Karen's escalation was not the behavior of someone in total control, but the desperate thrashing of a woman whose authority had been punctured. The damage Laurie had inflicted was real, and Karen's empire of water and image was cracking at the edges. One evening, when the wind shifted, Laurie caught the acrid stench of chemicals wafting from the estate, the kind of smell that suggested frantic attempts to cleanse or flush out the hardened slurry clogging the pipes. She imagined the workers tearing into the walls, breaking tiles, ripping through foundations, all to undo what she had unleashed. That image sustained her during the nights when the phone calls kept her awake, or when another notice arrived warning of penalties she could never afford to pay. But Karen did not stop with harassment. She sought to isolate Laurie completely. At the next association meeting, which Laurie attended out of stubbornness more than hope, Karen stood before the group with the calm poise of a stateswoman and announced that complaints had been filed against Laurie for disturbing the peace, spreading hostility, and failing to comply with the values of the community. Laurie, seated at the back of the room, felt every pair of eyes turned toward her, some filled with suspicion, others with weary resignation, as though they had already accepted the verdict. When she tried to speak, Karen interrupted smoothly, insisting that disruptions would not be tolerated, and the murmurs of agreement sealed the performance. Laurie left before the meeting ended, the sound of their polite applause for Karen ringing in her ears like a verdict of exile. That night, anger fused with exhaustion. Lori walked the boundary of her yard and stopped by the trench she had dug. She crouched in the darkness and listened to the faint gurgle of water still moving beneath the earth, and she realized that the battle was no longer about survival alone, but about dominance, about which of them could impose their will more completely. Karen had money, influence, and a chorus of sycophants, but Lori had knowledge now, the intimate awareness of the veins running beneath the soil, the hidden architecture of the land that her neighbor sought to exploit. She could not win through reputation or through the language of committees, but she could strike where Karen was most vulnerable, through the very infrastructure that fed her empire. In the days that followed, Lori began to plan with a precision that surprised her. She kept to herself, maintaining the appearance of fatigue and defeat, while secretly mapping every possible connection in the old water system, tracing the arteries that stretched beyond her property, and considering how they might be manipulated. She bought tools under the pretense of repairing her shed, storing them in hidden corners of the house. She began to note the rhythms of Karen's household, the hours when workers arrived, the times when lights flickered, the intervals when pumps hummed louder as if straining against some blockage. Each observation fed into her growing conviction that escalation was not only inevitable, but necessary. That the only way to survive was to ensure that Karen's fortress of stone and water collapsed under the weight of its own theft. And so Lori waited, her resolve hardening like the cement that had already begun its silent destruction inside the walls of the mansion, knowing that the second escalation was not merely retaliation, but preparation for the decisive confrontation that loomed ahead. The culmination arrived not in secrecy but in full exposure, a collision that had been building for weeks until neither woman could retreat from the trajectory of their hostility. Lori had spent restless nights listening to the machinery of Karen's estate falter and cough like a body failing under the weight of disease, each sound proof that the sabotage had reached deeper than plaster or paint, that the very skeleton of the mansion was choking on hardened cement. Yet Karen, refusing to appear defeated, doubled down with gestures of grandeur, throwing open her gates for a gathering meant to display resilience, inviting the association, neighbors, and officials under the pretense of celebrating a renovation. From her porch, Lori watched cars glide into the driveway, their headlights slicing the night, their passengers dressed in finery, their voices swelling with laughter that carried across the road like a challenge. She felt the weight of inevitability press against her chest. This was not merely a party, it was a public stage where Karen would once again try to humiliate her by rewriting the narrative. But fate, or perhaps the physics of pressure and blockage, had other plans. As the evening progressed and the guests assembled in the great hall, lights blazing across the estate, Lori noticed the strange shimmer of water at the base of the garden steps. At first, she thought it was only dew catching the light, but then it spread with alarming speed, a dark, glistening tide seeping outward, bubbling up through the seams of the marble patio. The pumps, strained beyond capacity, had finally surrendered, forcing water mixed with sludge and fragments of cement to erupt through the system's weakest points. Lori stood at the edge of her yard, transfixed as the spectacle unfolded, the laughter inside the house turning to shrieks as the first cracks split across the tiled floor, fountains of gray liquid gushing upward like grotesque geysers. Guests fled through the doors, their polished shoes splattered, their evening gowns stained, while Karen herself appeared on the threshold, her composure breaking at last, her voice rising above the chaos as she barked orders at workers who could do nothing against the deluge. The mansion, so carefully constructed as a monument to control and status, transformed before the neighborhood's eyes into a grotesque parody, its lights flickering as water shorted electrical systems, its gardens drowned under a spreading flood that smelled of lime and rot. Lori felt no triumph, only a grim certainty that this was the consequence Karen had summoned with her arrogance, the reversal of every humiliation she had inflicted. And though Lori had played her part in unleashing it, the collapse had a momentum of its own, as if the land itself had decided to purge the theft that had drained it for too long. Neighbors who once avoided Laurie now stood in clusters along the road, their faces pale with shock, whispering not about her but about Karen, their gazes shifting away from the woman who had ruled them for years with a mixture of fear and admiration. For a moment, Karen's eyes locked with Laurie's across the road, and in that gaze was the naked recognition that the battle was lost, that her empire of water and authority had crumbled in the most public, irreparable way. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words drowned beneath another roar as a pipe burst inside the walls, spraying the hall with a torrent that sent guests screaming into the night. Laurie did not move, did not answer, only stood silent as the mansion groaned under the weight of its undoing, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, a witness rather than a participant in the downfall. By midnight, the estate was cordoned off by emergency crews, their flashing lights painting the night with urgent colors. Karen, her gown ruined and her face streaked with grime, argued with officials whose patience had already thinned, her gestures wild, her words shrill enough to carry even across the road. Laurie remained on her porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cool air, watching with the steady composure of someone who had endured enough humiliation to savor the sight of balance restored. She felt no need to speak, no need to reveal what she knew, for the evidence of Karen's corruption lay in the ruins of her own home, broadcast before every neighbor who once feared her. The climax was not a battle of words or fists, but of exposure, a reckoning that left the queen of the neighborhood standing in the wreckage of her throne, while the woman she had tried to erase remained upright, silent and unbroken, her presence now undeniable. In the days that followed, the neighborhood existed in a strange silence, the kind that lingers after a storm has broken and left its imprint on the land. A silence filled with whispers but emptied of the old hierarchy. Karen's mansion stood ruined, its gardens drowned and its foundations compromised, guarded now by tarps and warning signs rather than the iron confidence she once radiated, and the sight of it each morning was a reminder that even the most carefully constructed facades can collapse when their core is rotten. Laurie moved through those days with a calm she had not felt since arriving, tending to her house, cleaning her porch, even planting new flowers by the willow, her hands working with a steadiness that came from the knowledge that she had survived a trial designed to erase her. No officials came to question her. No neighbors dared confront her, for the narrative had shifted irrevocably. Karen was no longer the guardian of order, but the architect of her own downfall, and the others, desperate to distance themselves, spoke of her only in hushed tones as though she were already gone. One afternoon a crew arrived, not for Karen but for Laurie, hired by the county after an overdue review of property records confirmed what her aunt had always said. The well was a protected structure, listed on old surveys as part of the region's historical water system. The men worked for hours, breaking apart the hardened mass of cement with careful tools, restoring the shaft until once again the dark glimmer of water appeared at the bottom, clean and cold as though it had been waiting all along. When the first bucket rose, dripping from the depths, Laurie felt something inside her release, a knot of tension dissolving into a quiet joy that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with continuity. She filled a glass, held it in her hands for a long moment, and then drank. The taste sharp and mineral, a taste of permanence that no committee or neighbor could ever erase. By evening, the sun dipped low over the ruined mansion, its light catching the tarps that flapped uselessly in the wind, and Laurie sat on her porch with the glass of water beside her, listening to the cicadas as they filled the air with their relentless song. She thought of her aunt, of the generations who had drawn life from the same source, and she knew that the struggle had bound her to this place more deeply than any inheritance could. She did not need to celebrate or explain, for the simple act of living, of remaining, was victory enough. And as darkness settled, she leaned back in her chair, watching the stars appear one by one, her well safe, her home intact, and her silence no longer a burden, but a shield.